Welcome to topic 2.5.1, Changing Context, as part of Education as a Context of Continual Change. Where we're at now, we're actually at the final of our 10 topics, so we're looking at the map here, and we're at this end point, or the top point on our map, vision and innovation. So we're looking at change, we're looking at the future, we're looking at some of the things that will affect your work now and into the future. So as a brief overview of what we're going to cover in this first topic, there'll be a bit of an introduction. We'll go through some of the levels of change, the education context that change happens in, some school reforms as an example, what some of the drivers of change are, and then teachers as change agents, which is particularly important for you to think about. So fundamentally, learning is about change. So if we think about trying to define learning, which again, it's another one of our complex terms like curriculum and pedagogy and many of the other terms we've been covering, learning is really about change occurring. So we know that we've learnt something when we are different than we were before. We've actually taken something on board, we've thought about something, we've engaged with something, and now we know something about that. So in a very basic way of defining it, we can say that coming to learn something is coming to know about something, and coming to do that, we are actually changing. So if we say that learning is about change, and we look at teaching as being about working with children to help them in their learning, then we have to say that teaching equals fostering an environment in which change can occur. So I've used this image here for you to just contemplate all the things that are going on around the child. And it's not about things going in and things coming out, but there's a whole variety of resources, ideas that are going into or coming together with this individual who's going through change, and that the learning has been about change. I'm going to talk to you now about levels of change. So I want you to see that change occurs in a variety of places within the educational context. And the broader idea of where the reforms and I guess our ideals as a society come from, that are driven through global, federal and state concepts, people, groups of people. So we look at what's going on globally. At the moment, we're very much looking to countries like Finland, for example, and what they're doing with their educational systems. And we also look often to the US and the UK. So once we've come up with sort of what our reforms are and our ideals are about education, the level of enactment comes through the policies, and so through documents like the curriculum. So groups of people get together and they talk about what their ideas are, what their ideals are, what their philosophies are, and the reforms are enacted through these documents. Then we also need to consider that change occurs in the learning environment itself. So that's what we're talking about school. And our three school areas that we're concerned with are early childhood, primary and secondary. So change occurs at that school level that's also influenced by these policies, by the curriculum, by the different reforms, by the things that are happening in other systems. But it also happens because of what's happening in that specific environment. And then we've got our learners and our teacher. So we have you in your classroom, and change is happening every day, and change is happening because you're flexible and you're adaptive, and that you've got a whole group of individuals that you're having to respond to, and then you have all these other inputs that are occurring. So we have this wider idea of change happening through governments and through policies. We have the idea that change is happening because of what the school is also driving and the different stakeholders involved in the school, and then we have you in the classroom. And so you're having to change. Every day is going to be different. Every 10 minutes might be different. So change is really ubiquitous in education. Okay, so let's pull this apart just a little bit. So the broad educational context. So it's widely regarded that education is a conservative discipline. And one of those reasons is because of these various stakeholders. So particularly parents, government and teachers are what are causing this to be in some ways necessarily conservative. And the reform is actually driven by what is seen by the stakeholders to be good education at that particular time. So that time in history. So that means it's being affected by all sorts of socio-cultural ideas that are happening around us. It's not something that occurs in isolation, but it's often something that's very particular to its time. And just to look briefly at the list I've created here, so some of these things that might affect reform, and particularly at the moment, testing and test results, in Australia comparing itself to other countries through things like the PISA. So we have, NAPLAN's is a reform that's come into place that's supposed to be driving a change in the levels of numeracy and literacy. And that's again come back to this, what we're seeing as being, how do we measure education at this time? And that's being seen as something that people, society, government, the stakeholders believe that they want to see in education. The focus on the child's been very important, and it has shifted the way that education is enacted very much through the end of the last century, so sort of through from the 60s through to now. There's been this shift into being much more child focused, and we've talked a lot about that in this topic. So, school looks different now to what it did in the early part of the last century and prior to that. And some of the other things that come into play, I guess on a more micro level, are kind of what's the pedagogy of the time. Behaviourism used to be very popular. Constructivism has become very popular now, and then there's also a bit of a shift towards we combine it. We'll use what we need in the context. Things like different teaching approaches, so flipped classrooms and game-based learning have become a bit of a very popular idea at the moment. So people are trying them out, and they might stick and they might not. So you probably know of things that might have happened in your classroom when you were a child that maybe you won't ever see again, or maybe you'll see it come back. And often teachers say things like that. Teachers have been teaching a long time will say, I used to teach like this and now I'm being asked to teach like it again. Or yes, we used to do that and then it fell out of favour and, it's coming back in again. So we also have cycles of different approaches that we can see that that's all part of change. So we're in this constant sort of state of change, and things like technology that I'm going to talk about in the next topic also very much influence and drive the types of change that has been occurring in our context. I'm going to bring in here Hargreaves and Shirley and their ideas of the 4 ways of educational change, and they've written a number of books about this. Now, they don't necessarily see these 4 ways as happening chronologically or particularly at a particular point in time, although their first way was really something that was the kind of late 60s into the 70s, and then we move into the second to fourth ways in a much more based on particular context, so the local context. So you'll have read through this now. So, there was this investment in public education. There was this move towards child-centred approaches to learning, but there was still this passive trust from parents who let the teachers get along with the job. And some of you who maybe grew up through the 70s will have remembered that potentially the school environment you were in was changing, and we went to things like open plan and groups, and there was different sorts of ways of actually having the school environment actually occurring. Moving into the second way, they talk about being driven by particular sorts of legislation. So it was very much came from the government pressuring schools to achieve at a very high level. So that goes back to a bit of what I was talking about testing. And so we still do see that in many education systems globally. And I think we do see that a little bit in our own system here in Australia. So moving into the third and the fourth way, the third way came about as seeing more collaboration and this idea of professional learning communities. So really developing those communities so that it wasn't being driven so much from the government, from the top-down pressure, but actually coming out of teachers working together. So coming from a collective and an understanding that it was important for teachers to be continually learning and to be looking at new ways to develop the sorts of change within their own school environment. So having that sense of more autonomy. And this is where we really move into the fourth way. I mentioned Finland, and Hargreaves and Shirley sort of point to countries like Finland, for example, as as models of how this is happening. And this idea that there is more autonomy so that they're able to respond in a very individual and personalized. And personalized learning is a very contemporary idea as well that's being drawn into the educational context as being particularly important, and trying to find ways to how do we do this. So something that Hargreaves and Shirley particularly talk about are teachers, principals and sort of leaders within education having an increased capacity to actually implement change. So while I've said education is conservative, education is very innovative, but it's actually having the capacity to be innovative. So it's matching the innovative with the conservative and with the stakeholders. So let's think about this now as teachers and teachers having progressive practice. So we mentioned professional learning communities, and you'll see in your Churchill text that's actually spoken about as well. And it's spoken about as being very important for teachers to be empowered to be able to actually make change. Churchill again says, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And this is a really interesting idea. And my other example I'm going to use is the reform at a school level, because this is what's happened. So we've got things like charter schools that you might have heard of in the US, and free schools are coming through in the UK. And we're seeing independent public schools in Australia, which is very much being promoted by the federal government. And something that's appeared is, particularly looking at the charter schools in the US, is that because of the autonomy and because it's being driven very much by what parents believe is best and what they want, the schools are actually, instead of being highly innovative, and this isn't all of them, but instead of being highly innovative, they're actually reverting back to how the parents themselves were educated. So they're actually going back to a very conservative model of students sitting at desks in rows doing bookwork in order to improve their numeracy and literacy. So this return to the 3 R's, you would have heard these sorts of things, ideas, catchphrases, I guess, being bandied about. And so this idea of reforming school and that being very innovative and it's great, it's change, it's creating autonomy, has the potential to actually going back to what is actually very conservative and a much more traditional model. So this is what I've said. So it's driven by parents and communities, underpinned by the concept of greater independence and autonomy. And while New South Wales have rejected the independent public schools model, it's been taken on in Western Australia and Queensland. There are these similar sorts of directives in New South Wales, which was the local schools, local decisions, reforms. And these, again, are very much driven by the idea of there being more autonomy for the schools as far as budget goes and staffing as in particular. So I just want you to stop for a moment and ask yourself, why are you becoming a teacher? Is it for the money? Is it for the holidays? Or is it for the prestige of being a teacher? I'd suggest that most of you would say it's to make a difference. And I've pulled this very big quote out from Fullan, but you'll see the bit I've highlighted, to make a difference in the lives of students. Now, in 1992, they did a survey at the University of Toronto, and they found that 20% of the student teachers there said it was to make a difference. And then Fullan goes on to describe, why this is, of course, it's perhaps overgeneralizing, but it is in fact is found to be highly true amongst pre-service teachers and teachers. And it moves us on to the idea that teachers can be change agents, and teachers should be change agents. And it's a particularly strong idea, again, that Fullan takes through his work. So I've listed a few things here just for you to think about, and I guess the thrust of what we want to say to you is that as a teacher, you have the capacity to affect change, and it's highly likely that you came into wanting to be part of the profession of teaching because you could see that you could make a difference, and by making a difference, what you're doing is you're affecting change. So I've put in a list of possible things that could happen there for you to think about yourselves as change agents, and the 3 little images are to get you thinking about, sometimes it means going against the stream, like the red fish against the blue fish. So we're working in a context that's conservative. We're working in a context that is prone to change, that change is ubiquitous, and yet we have to also be very mindful that this is why we're here, that we're actually here as change agents. And change isn't just something that happens to us, but it's something that we can be part of. In the second of these presentations for this topic, I'm going to be focusing on technology, but I just wanted to introduce it to you in concluding from this one, because I want you to see that this is one of the drivers for change in our contemporary society. So Fullan suggests that school is increasingly boring for students and alienating for teachers. Now he refers to this as the push-pull factor in schooling. And what that is the push is towards technology and the pull is away from school. Now, why that's important is because, again, he suggests that what we need to do is to change school pedagogy and the way we conceptualize learning because of this. So we can see that technology can be one of the drivers, and it is one of the drivers for change that we're seeing at the moment, and that it's a very important one, and that we need to be seeing very significant change in order to maintain engagement of not just our students but also of our teachers. So I hope you've enjoyed this first topic, and the second topic will be focusing on some of the technology and some of the future thinking about teaching and change.